Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today I'm going to be doing a brief look at the recent change to spawn costs for IR missiles and ground battles in the game of War Thunder, how it affects the meta, and I also want to have a little chat about the current state of CAS in top tier ground RB. So as of the most recent patch, the developers put through a nerf for the spawn costs in terms of the infrared missiles fired from planes in ground battles. The nerf was an 8% increase that for the top planes will raise their spawn cost from 896 with these missiles all the way up to 972. Now somebody with a calculator and a knowledge of how to do percentages is probably telling themselves right now, that's not 8%, you're correct, it's pretty close to 8%, but as I discussed in the loadout video, the game does a fair bit of rounding, so this does result in it not quite being 8%, but at least close enough for government work. So the spawn cost for any of the top 12.7 jets in ground RB to get an IR missile will be 972 from now on. As far as what missiles currently use IR guidance, these are several variants of the Maverick, including the D and G model. It also includes the Hammer missiles for France, at least the IR guided ones, and of course missiles like the rather infamous KH-38. Of note, this doesn't include helicopter IR missiles. I did some testing and it looked like both the Spike and the PARs were basically at the same spawn cost they were previously, so this is just for the plane launched IR missiles. So the question I imagine a lot of people wondering is how much more difficult does this make this to spawn in a plane with IR missiles? And the answer is not very. In the background you're seeing a game with Russian top tier. I first spawned the BMD-4, got one kill, scouted one thing, but the thing didn't end up dying, so it didn't reduce the spawn cost, as you'll see in the background. Additionally, I spawned the T-72B3 and just drove up the middle because I figured it's a Russian tank, driving up the middle is definitely going to work, and spoiler, it did. I got one kill, 2 assists off of that, absorbed quite a few shots, probably way more than I should have, and that was exactly enough for a Su-30. So in total, 2 kills, 2 deaths, 2 assists, and some eaten shots from the T-72B3 was enough to get a top plane with IR missiles. I will leave it up to you, the viewer, as to whether or not you think that should be enough to get a plane with IR missiles. I'm just trying to give you an accurate idea of roughly how much it takes, and honestly, the answer is not very much. A big reason for this is because War Thunder works in relatively large increments of spawn points. You don't generally get 1 or 2 spawn points at a time. You'll get 100 or 200 at a time depending on activities. Certainly you could do lighter activities and get lower increments, but usually it's single kill, single zone cap, stuff like that. And this doesn't really seem to meaningfully affect it all that much by increasing it by 8%. If you have a hero shooter like Overwatch and you increase the timer it takes to actually charge up your ultimate by 8%, that is generally going to be about an 8% increase in the ultimate. However, in War Thunder, if it takes 3 kills and then it takes 3 kills after the nerf, then it's still basically taking the same amount of time. So in practice, this isn't really doing all that much. In fact, this is probably doing less than most people think it's doing because, well, any good player is going to do what you see here. I've actually created different loadouts, one for laser guided missiles, one for KH-38s with the full IR seeker, and then once the nerf hit, I created a loadout for KH-29s with the TV seeker, because the spawn cost for a missile with the TV seeker didn't actually change, and in many scenarios the KH-29 ends up being almost as good as the KH-38. So in practice, at least on the Su-30SM, what this means is that sometimes instead of dying to KH-38, you'll die to KH-29s instead, that will hit you from basically just as far away and have about the same chance of killing you. This also raises another interesting observation in that the Russian aircraft are actually the ones that have the most quote-unquote backup options for viable missiles. You obviously have the laser-guided KH-38s, the thermal-guided KH-38s, the TV-guided KH-29s, and even laser-guided bombs on the Su-30SM, all of which can be thrown into a loadout. So even if a specific loadout becomes more expensive, you just take the next most expensive one. This doesn't realistically end up being all that much of a nerf for either the Su-34 or the Su-30SM. This is a somewhat minor nerf for the French Rafale because the French Rafale only has the IR seeker and the laser seekers for the hammers, so you don't really have a TV seeker in between, but on the whole, the Rafale is probably one of the best aircraft you can possibly spawn in ground RB right now, so I think the Rafale probably could use a bit of a hit. It's one of the best aircraft in the game in general, and in ground RB is a bit of a powerhouse. Obviously, this is a pretty big buff to the Typhoons because the Typhoons only have laser seekers on their brimstones, so they end up being noticeably cheaper than a lot of the other aircraft they're preying on when they're doing the air superiority roll, so it will help them out a little, but it's not really that big of a deal. The biggest hit is probably going to be on any plane that relies on the American Maverick missile, which is basically all of the American planes and several other planes for other nations, because the IR Mavericks were already not that good to begin with. You could frequently lock targets, hit them, and not kill them. On top of that, the lock range in which it could reliably track and hit a target was significantly shorter. It was also a lot slower, so it took longer to arrive, which increased the likelihood the target would simply break line of sight anyway, and was also a lot easier to intercept with surface-to-air missiles. On top of that, it's also incredibly uncommon to see a plane that has the infrared model Mavericks and also the TV Seeker Mavericks, so typically their best backup weapon is something like a laser-guided Maverick, which are even more unreliable than the IR-guided Mavericks. So the backup options for these planes, if you can't quite afford the IR Mavericks, is actually pretty anemic. All told, I would rate this nerf as exceedingly minor. The Su-30SM is probably the single biggest offender in terms of its use of IR missiles, but the Su-30SM is also the plane that can best make do with just using TV-guided missiles, so even if it can't quite get that extra bit of spawn points to get the new IR missiles, it can still get the older KH-29 TV missiles and probably do just as much damage. With all of that being said, I do want to have a bit of a chat on the nature of top-tier cash right now, and exactly why this nerf is actually even more minor than most people realize. I want to take a few minutes and give you guys a behind the scenes of some of the issues that I've had actually getting meaningful footage for the top tier review series when it comes to planes. It turns out the first thing I always research and put in my lineup is the jet, because the jet is actually the hardest thing to get what I would rate as good footage for, and there are actually a few different reasons for that. And I imagine this statement probably confuses a few people, because what you'll see a lot on Reddit, TikTok, whatever, a lot of content creators will parrot this, is that top tier CAS is so OP, you're just going to get a million kills and you're going to win the game just by spawning one plane, whatever. And in my experience, that's kind of the opposite of how top tier CAS actually works. Obviously, experiences will vary from player to player, but I have used basically every top tier CAS plane at this point. I've used every top tier munition, and I've had top tier review videos where I've had to get footage of using every plane and every munition. So while there is definitely going to be some variance from player to player and probably even server to server to an extent, this has at least been my experience with the matter, and I hope you guys can trust, based on my previous videos, at least the regular viewers, that I don't exactly have a habit of glazing over the problems that the developers have with the game, or even glazing over problems that Russian vehicles in particular have, so hopefully my opinions on this will carry at least some bit of weight. In the background is the footage that I used for the intro when I was doing the Hornet Sting review. This is a 3K that I got with the F-18, and I want to be as clear as possible. As soon as I spawned this plane, the game was already over. My team had already lost, and I actually checked the mission timer. This was 2 minutes and 28 seconds into the game was when I spawned this F-18. It's not exactly a speed run into a CAS plane, but it's noticeably faster than your average player, and you could replace all of the single Mavericks that you see on this F-18 with triple Mavericks, and I could hit and kill every last one of them, and my team would still lose. My team is that far behind 2 minutes and 28 seconds into the match. On top of that, it doesn't take too long after I get this triple kill to where my RWR starts lighting up as the enemy team and many of the players that I just killed spawn in planes, and I get jumped by 3 enemy aircraft, and spoiler, I do not survive that. So yes, the triple kill looked flashy and looked like it took no skill to execute, and really it didn't, but it didn't affect the game at all. My team still lost and still lost hard, and I didn't do anything else after that triple kill. I basically spent 896 spawn points just to pad my kill death ratio, and that was essentially it. Of course, also a handy time to look at that Su-30SM game from earlier. When I went back to base to RTB, I started getting spiked by an F-15, and then I also ended up fighting an F-16. The F-15 was high, the F-16 was low. Spoiler, unless the two enemies are baked potatoes, you probably don't win that fight, so I got one good attack run off. It was pretty solid, 4 kills, 1 aircraft. I'm not going to say that's nothing, but the enemy were coming off of spawn. I was basically killing an enemy team that was already defeated, and this is one of the other core things that I would point out about a lot of these triple quad feeds, whatever, is that if you're taking out the enemy that's already defeated, then again, all you're really doing is padding your KDs. The map was already won before you ever took off in that plane. And now here's some more footage of me spawning in a Rafale, and you will see that I have a Su-25 locked basically as soon as I spawn in. Then I start getting spiked by a Su-30, and then a little bit later a Su-34 comes up from behind me. So yeah, I was in a 3v1 here and yet again did not win that fight. And one last clip that perfectly encapsulates this: I actually get enough spawn points in this BMD to spawn in a Su-34 and get in the air, and I have essentially nothing to shoot at. The whole enemy team is wiped out. This poor little weasel is about to eat a KH-38, but this is not doing anything. Again, this is just padding my KDs. It's not winning the match. It's not being decisive. It's not taking out enemies I need to take out at a point in the game when it will matter. Now, the reason why all of this is a problem for getting footage for something like the top tier review series is a single attack run where you get a triple or quad feed looks really cool, but is only about 30 seconds to a minute of footage. So I could either do multiple attack runs, or I could try to get a game where I actually do something more than just a single salvo of missiles. And getting a game where you do something more than just a single salvo of missiles is actually pretty hard, because most of the time the game ends before you get to do basically anything else. In that respect, I learned a long time ago that you basically get the top tier plane first, and then you actually play all of the other vehicles, and while you're playing them, you look for opportunities to get better footage with the top tier plane than just a single attack run, so that you can talk for about 3 to 4 minutes about the merits of that plane. The reason I want to show all of you this is the kind of stuff you don't see. If you only ever play ground battles, or if you only ever know about top tier by basically what you see on TikTok or Reddit, or even from a lot of content creators, you would think that every time you spawn a plane, it's a 3 or 4 kill and it immediately wins the match, and your team is definitely going to win because you did it, and that's just not how this is generally happening. Top tier matches are so fast paced in terms of how quickly you can win or lose it. They're basically won or lost on the opening break by whoever has the stronger MPT lineup, and a lot of times the planes are just batting cleanup. That's not to say that planes never matter or that planes can't be impactful, but they're usually a lot more impactful later in the match when the teams have been whittled down, if you do actually get a match that goes that long, because at that point getting 4 or 5 kills when the enemy only has 6 or 7 people left is a really big deal, but getting 3 or 4 kills when the enemy has 16 left doesn't really do anything. Now, at least somebody watching this is going to be curious as to why I have footage of a Leclerc driving across a large Alamein in the background, and that's because this is a woodland camo tank on a desert map with no overhead cover. I even have a giant French flag on the top, so obviously if top tier class is oppressive and everywhere and overpowered, I should be getting plowed by missiles left and right. But I'm not. In fact, I drive all the way from one side of the map to the other. And this wraps back around to the point: the maps where you don't get hit by these missiles don't stand out in your mind. They're just normal maps. It's an observation bias thing where the big flashy event stands out in your mind, but all of the mundane day-to-day stuff doesn't. And I feel like more top tier gameplay needs to be stuff like this. And if you think this is just a one-off, you can go back and check my German top tier review. You'll see a map where I am in a snow map with very high contrast in a Leopard 2A6, and I get 10 kills and never once even get shot at by an enemy plane or helicopter. It's not that uncommon. I could show you 100 maps where that happens, but people don't focus on those because they're not big and they're not flashy. And the real reason I'm doing this, and the point of this chat, is because a lot of people don't actually play top tier, or they only play top tier ground because grinding out 2 separate tech trees is a bit of a chore. But it's important to understand what it's actually like, because it's not as linear as most people think it is. Number one, obviously it does take a lot of spawn costs and the maps are very fast, but number two, in a 12.7 match, you're pretty much guaranteed that at least about a third of the enemy team has these top tier jets as well. And since the rise of a lot more nations getting Fox 3 carriers that have competent air to ground, you're pretty much guaranteed that if you fire off a salvo and get a triple or quad kill or whatever, that at least one of those people will have a plane, will come up after you, and will try to kill you, and in all likelihood will probably succeed. On top of that, as I kind of hinted at with the Typhoon earlier, because the Fox 3 missile loadout costs significantly less than a full ground loadout, any enemy that just wants to clear the sky or has access to good laser-guided missiles can be up well before you and just waiting for you as soon as you spawn in. But I do want to wrap this back a bit to the subject of the IR missiles, and specifically the KH-38, because as I said, the enemy can be up in the air with Fox 3 missiles when you spawn in, but you can start locking the KH-38s the instant you spawn. They are fast missiles, they are hard to intercept by a lot of anti-aircraft systems, and generally speaking, they will hit and they will kill whatever they contact with. This means that even if you are in the air with Fox 3 missiles when a Su-34 or a Su-30 SM spawns, they can still get off a full salvo before you actually intercept them unless you're basically already at the air spawn. The problem with the KH-38s is not that they have IR guidance specifically. The problem with the KH-38 is that their lock range is so ridiculous and they are so fast that enemy air and anti-air do not have any ability to respond. So if you do actually get a game where air does matter, you do have an inherent advantage with these missiles because the enemy can't stop you from firing them unless they're basically already camping your spawn. On top of that, because you can dump all of your missiles faster, you can also RTB faster, you can reload faster, and then you don't need to get as much speed or altitude to launch the new salvo of missiles. And this is the core problem and why the KH-38 is a fundamental issue, whereas missiles like the Hammer are annoying but generally fine, and the Mavericks are kind of underpowered. Whenever you do get one of those games where air power does matter, it does become pretty obvious pretty quickly how much better the KH-38 is than every other IR missile. And this is the part of this nerf that slightly annoys me because the problem really was one missile. It wasn't every IR missile that was dominating matchups. And to boot, the developers are also well aware of this. The Su-25 SM-3 is a subsonic aircraft with no Fox 3 missiles, and just giving it KH-38s by itself was so overpowered it had to be moved all the way up to 12.7 with some of the best jets in the game. It just feels to me personally like the developers are trying far too hard to use a global rule when really there is one specific missile that is a much bigger problem than the rest. Of course, this wraps back around to another issue because, as I kind of said earlier, a lot of these planes are not getting up in the air or firing these missiles at a time when it's actually relevant to the outcome of the match. They're not influencing the win or loss ratio of their team to any meaningful degree. So the problem with these missiles is not their efficiency, which also means a minor nerf to their efficiency isn't really going to affect their usage. If you're on the ground and you get hit in the head by a KH-38, are you going to be saying, oh thank god, that missile cost 972 spawn points, it could have cost 896? No. The problem with these missiles has always been their interactivity. You can't really do much about them, both on the ground and in the air, and this nerf doesn't do anything about the interactivity. That's not to say that I want the spawn cost for any of these IR missiles to go back down. I'm simply pointing out that if you're solely honing in on efficiency for a tactic that was already not as efficient, you're probably barking up the wrong tree, and you need to be looking for a more long-term solution in terms of increasing the means at which the players can interact with this element. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. If you agree or disagree, feel free to drop a comment down below. I always love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, donkey bitch shoes.